Hello, everybody. Good evening. Professor Ron, first, I'm Nawa Patel. I'm the chair of Middle Eastern Studies. Professor Ron Hendel is the Norma and Sam Dabby Professor of Hebrew Bible and Jewish Studies at UC Berkeley, and the recipient of multiple awards for his work in the field of Hebrew Bible, especially Genesis and memory. His published work is extensive and covers everything from mythology, prophecy, text criticism, literary criticism, religion, ritual, to linguistics and epigraphy. In between, he wrote dozens of popular papers about topics in biblical Hebrew, biblical scholarship, and Jewish studies. Although his academic writing is sharp and critical, in real life, he's one of the nicest and wittiest people in Hebrew Bible, up there with our very own Bruce Wells. I want to highlight one thread in Professor Hendel's scholarly work that I find particularly admirable and worthy of imitation. Most scholars don't bother to articulate the methodological framework in which they work. Professor Hendel is the polar opposite. Not only does he take the time to outline the theoretical basis for his scholarship, his last two books are intentionally meant to be a highly accessible how-to works. His most recent book, How Old is the Hebrew Bible, which he co-authored with Jan Yosten, is a masterpiece of this genre. In it, Hendel and Yosten outline the method by which one can date biblical texts and explain the value and benefit of their method over alternative explanations. His insistence on principles of good scientific work, coupled with familiarity with the relevant sources, is an inspiration. And today he's going to talk to us about the Bible as a book of memory. Please join me in welcoming Dr.
Well, that was the nicest introduction I've ever had. Wow, I'm just going to sit down and sort of take that in, because that was so sweet. Thank you, Naama. Wow. So today, I've got pictures. I'm talking about the Bible as a book of memory, and the examples that I want to use are the Exodus and the Queen of Sheba. This is actually a picture of Solomon and the Queen of Sheba from the time, real life, and they're looking at something kind of scared. But this actually connects a little bit with the Exodus too, because Yul Brynner, who's Solomon here, this is a young Yul Brynner when he had hair. This is for people of my generation who, you students don't know this. He was Ramses in the Ten Commandments, so he plays an important role both in the Queen of Sheba story and in the Exodus story, which are the two stories. And this is Gina Lola Brigida, who passed away last month, so this is also a tribute to her. Not that I knew her. So I want to start out by, by the way, how long am I supposed to go for? It's 5? You want to be? 44 minutes. Yeah, okay, perfect. So I want to start out by talking a little bit about the idea of the idea of the Bible as a book of memory, which has to do with the idea of collective, what scholars call collective memory or cultural memory. Now, on the one hand, this sounds like a weird thing. How can you have collective memory? Because we're not really collectives. We're not like the Borg in Star Trek, where we're actually connected into a group brain. So how can you have a social memory, a collective memory? Well, to explain this, I just want to say that this is actually a very familiar concept. I'm staying at the AT&T hotel down the street. I don't know which direction it is. And when you walk in the front door, there's a little pillar with a quote from the New Testament, okay, which is perfectly nice. And then right next to it, on the facing arch, is a quote by Colonel Travis from the Alamo, okay? And I think that's a very interesting linkage, the Bible, the Alamo. So in Texas, you understand cultural memory. Why? Because you remember the Alamo. This is something that in Texas, you're taught to remember the Alamo when you're a child. And it's part of the social identity of Texans that this is part of your cultural memory. It encodes the values that emerge from these past events. And the quote by Colonel Travis is very moving. What does he say? Liberty or death or something like that. So these are things that one knows viscerally, that there is collective memory that is transmitted to, initiates into a particular group. And there's all sorts of groups that we participate in that have these kind of collective memories. As a Texan, you're introduced to the collective memory of the Alamo as something that's constitutive of Texan identity. It makes Texan identity different than, let's say, Oklahoma identity, if I can speak of something so low and loathsome. So these are things that mark your social group, okay, and that there's boundaries of that group, and it's part of being on the inside to know and participate and value these memories. And you're taught it as children as you're being initiated and acculturated into this group. There's other groups too. Let's say, being a student at UT Austin, right? There's lore about, I don't know, hook 'em horns kinds of things that are part of, and there's probably stories about that. I don't even know, but there must be, the one, win one for the Gipper or something. I don't know if there's a Longhorn story about that, but things like that. If you are in a particular religious community, Southern Baptists have their own stories. Catholics of this diocese have their own stories. Is this true? Okay. So religious groups have their own cultural memory, and it helps define the boundaries and the inclusions and the exclusions. The Southern Baptists on this street are completely different than the Southern Baptists on that street because they just, separated over some ridiculous thing that each of them regards as really important and things like that. So the different groups that we belong to, professional groups, professors of Bible. We have cultural memories of our lineal ancestors and, and things that to outsiders seem trivial, to insiders seem very important even, hundreds of years after the fact. We were just talking about controversies about the views of a particular biblical scholar from the 1880s, which still gets people worked up. But only biblical scholars know about these particular group memories that are still being, contested and fought over and define who one is and which group one has affinity to. So this is just to say that this idea of cultural memory is actually a very familiar experience. Okay? It's just the term sounds a little weird, but as an analytical term, it does actually refer to things. Okay, one of the things that I want to emphasize also about cultural memory is that various groups, and in particular, I want to talk about nations and kind of larger political groups, because I want to talk about ancient Israel. So for a nation to exist, it has to have a body of cultural memories, of collective memories. And this actually goes back to another 19th century scholar, French guy, Ernest Renan. He said that there's really two things that make a nation: shared memories and a kind of common consent to be in this group. And he further said, not only do you have to have a body, a legacy of shared memories, but it's also important, it's also necessary that there are many things that one remembers in common. He says, but also it's necessary that they have forgotten many things. Okay, so to have collective memories also means you have collective forgettings. It's very important to forget certain things. Now I want to tread lightly about the next thing I'm going to say, but I can't resist. I used to teach in Dallas, so I was in Texas for a number of years. And one year, a reporter had a big article in the Dallas paper saying, you know what they were really fighting about at the Alamo? Whew. And this guy was just almost run out of town, the reporter. Because it turns out they were fighting for their freedom. Can I say this next thing?
Yeah.
Which included the freedom to own slaves. Because Mexico had made slavery illegal. And so that was one of the main reasons that they didn't want to be part of Mexico. So they're fighting for freedom, but that was one of the their freedom, but not for the freedom of their slaves. That's one of the big things they were fighting for. Okay, now let me just ask, no one's packing heat in here.
They don't have to tell you.
They don't have to tell me, okay. Because I know I'm walking a little bit on fine ground. But my point here is that these were inconvenient facts that qualify these cultural memories. People didn't want to hear them. So this emphasizes my point, or proves my point, that to have collective memories, it's also very important to have forgotten certain things. For those cultural memories to function as cultural memories, you have to forget certain things, or else the whole thing doesn't work. Okay? So I live in California. I teach at Berkeley. We used to have this thing called Columbus Day. You heard of that? No, not anymore. Now it's called Indigenous Peoples Day. Do they have that in Austin too?
I think it's still Columbus Day.
Still Columbus Day?
The city of Austin is technically Indigenous people.
Okay, there you go. So this is what happens when cultural memory, the things that have been forgotten are kind of recovered. And it complicates the cultural, and you find that this cultural memory is plural, that other groups, let's say Native American groups, remember the past and have their own cultural memory, which clashes. There's a kind of counter memory between these different groups. Okay, and once you learn that counter memory that they have has things that were forgotten in the dominant memory, then you reevaluate and the cultural memory changes. Okay, so the cultural memory is not a monolithic thing. I mean, it's always changing to some extent because different groups will have clashing memories, and the degree to which they're communicating with each other can make changes in these different groups. Plus, social conditions can change such that certain things that are normal in a past decade might be problematic in this decade. And so the cultural memory changes to accommodate those things. So cultural memory is not a static thing. Even the memory of the Alamo is not a static thing. So there's always conflict, there's alternative versions, there's contested memories of the past, and this happens, I think, in every culture, or at least in every culture that I know about. Okay? So you have to forget things for cultural memory to work. Good. So let me move on to my examples here. The Exodus and the Queen of Sheba. Now Passover is coming up. So again, I'm walking on thin ice here but this is, this is what professors do. Okay, so here's the cultural memory of the Exodus that has become, this is the traditional memory in Judaism and Christianity, but this is a picture from a Haggadah, which is the handbook that you read from. It's the ritual reenactment of the Exodus, or the ritual recitation of the Exodus events at the Passover ceremony. So it's a ritualized, it's ritualized commemoration. It's ritualized memory of the servitude in Egypt and the Exodus, the rescue from Egypt and so forth. So here's a picture of the Israelites doing their slavery things and bearing burdens under the harsh overlord of Pharaoh. And then there's ritual things. I love the dog on top who's giving some wine to a rabbit. So this is a ritual context, a ritual occasion where you're commanded to remember the Exodus story and to recite the Exodus story. So this really is cultural memory, and one of the important things is that in a lot of cultural memories, it is ritually reenacted at regular occasions. And this is where, you know, people are initiated into this memory and reactualizes that memory for the group. Okay? And the Passover ceremony, it's a family thing, so there's a social group involved. And so this is very much a way that these memories come alive in performances, in ritual performances. So this is the normal view. It says here, we were slaves to Pharaoh in Egypt, and he brought us out. Yahweh Elohim brought us out from there with a strong hand and an outstretched arm. And if he had not brought us out, and then you kind of break out into song. Ilu, Hotzi, Hotzi. So it becomes a kind of sense, there's a lot of sensations involved. Singing, music, recitation, drinking. You drink 4 glasses of wine. When I was a child, you drank 4 glasses of really terrible wine. But nowadays, you can drink a little better quality of wine. But the drinking of wine also goes to the kind of ritual, you know, this is more than ordinary life. This is an actualization of a memory that's coming to life through all of these kind of sensible bodily experiences. But the recitation of the story is key. Now, what I want to do, a little bit like with the Alamo, is do something that a German scholar who's good at this topic calls mnemohistory. That is to say, the history of memory. How do these memories get constructed? And then, of course, this, I was talking in the Genesis class today, this is what scholars do. We historicize things. So where did this memory of the Exodus come from? And you know, how can we relate it to things that actually happened and things like that? So, you know, we're curious. We want to know. Okay? I'm giving a talk next week on Zoom, and the person gave me the title, What Really Happened at the Exodus? And my answer is, well, it depends on what you mean by really and what you mean by happened. So here's the problem of doing a mnemohistory of the Exodus. Archaeologists tell us stuff. Now, I'm not an archaeologist, so don't hold me responsible. But archaeologists, and there's a bunch of them, and they're very animated figures, and they love to argue with each other. But one of the things that they actually agree with each other is that ancient Israel emerged as an indigenous phenomenon in the hill country of Canaan in the transition from the late Bronze Age to the Iron Age. That means around 1200 or so BC. All of these villages pop up in the hill country of Israel, like around Jerusalem, and where the hill countries are now, in places where no one had been living before. Okay, so it just kind of pops up like one of these, you know, suburban developments outside of Austin. Okay, the developers get together. But they're, you know, they're small villages. It's kind of subsistence agriculture. They're like unwalled, so there's not like conflict going on. And the culture, the material culture of these places is all local Canaanite stuff. They're making the same kind of architecture and pottery and farming, and we can tell eventually the language that they're speaking. It's Canaanite. It's all local stuff. So there's no clue that these people came out of Egypt, okay? And they certainly didn't conquer the people of Canaan. This was a peaceful, local, kind of boring development of a new kind of hill country, rural culture. So that's what really happened in terms of history, the archaeologists tell us. Moreover, some of this was stuff that happened after the Six-Day War when Israel took the West Bank. Fortunately, didn't they give that back and make peace with the Palestinians? Oh, never mind. Anyway, when they took the West Bank, the archaeologists kind of licked their chops and did a lot of archaeology in that area before they made peace. And they did the same thing in the Sinai, which they had taken from Egypt, which they actually did give back, if memory serves. There's an inconsistency there. So they did the same intensive surveys in the Sinai, nothing. No sign of anybody wandering in the wilderness for 40 years, no sign of 600,000 men plus women and children and donkeys, no sign of any large population movements or even small population movements. And they really looked. So early Israel, they didn't come from Egypt, they didn't wander in the wilderness, they didn't conquer the land of Canaan. This is a local indigenous phenomenon. The archaeologists say. And so, it's not me. Don't blame me. But all of this has been forgotten.
I'm about to. Knees crossed.
So this has all been forgotten. Okay, now let me give you an important clue here. The archaeologists and historians of the period also agree that what made this new polity or social group possible in the hill country that then formed the people of Israel, which is a new kind of political entity, is roughly the same kind of circumstances that allowed other rural polities to pop up at the same time in Edom and Ammon and Moab and stuff at roughly the same time. And that is the recession, the decline and fall of the Egyptian empire in Canaan. So here's the clue, okay? The Egyptians had been ruling over this region for 400 or 500 years, and all of a sudden their empire collapsed. And the Egyptians left and went back to Egypt. And the lifting or the disappearance of Egyptian control allowed these new social groups to kind of coalesce and to prosper and become their own local ethnicities and stuff. That too has been forgotten. There's no memory of the Egyptian empire in Canaan in the biblical text. But what do we have? And here's my proposal. What do we have in the memory of these events in the period that led up to and eventuated in the rise of Israel in this period around 1200? According to biblical memory, the original Israelites, the Hebrews, were slaves to Egypt for 400 years. What they say. So all of a sudden you say, well, they've forgotten the Egyptian empire in Canaan, which was ruling over them for, and the last part of it was particularly harsh. It was basically a military occupation during the Ramesside period, which was the last part. You've heard of Ramses. Well, Ramses is what Yul Brynner was. So it's basically a military occupation during the Ramesside period, which was the last part of the Egyptian empire, and then it just collapsed. That's not remembered, that's forgotten. But what we have in its place is a memory of servitude to Egypt, of being slaves to Pharaoh in Egypt. Now, it doesn't seem like that was really the case, but think about this with me. Egypt was not just Egypt in that period. Egypt owned the land of Canaan and was ruling over the land of Canaan. So in a sense, the people before the early Israelites, the ancestors of the early Israelites, were slaves of Pharaoh in Egypt, or in the Egyptian empire, in Egyptian territory. You see what I mean? But they didn't have to go to Egypt to do that, because Egypt had come to them and taken them over. Now, let me expand on that a little bit. So this is my version of the Nemo history of the Exodus. I just want to show you a few items that illustrate the ideology of empire, the idea of the Egyptian empire in Canaan. And this is how the Egyptians thought about it. Here's a stele of Thutmose III, and this kind of iconography occurs over and over again during the Egyptian empire. These are conquered cities of Canaan, and each of them has the name of the city, and around it is a picture of a bound captive. That is to say, a bound Canaanite captive. And we can tell they're talking about Canaanites by the hairdo. which is cute. There's different hairdos for Canaanites and Philistines and, Nubians and Hittites and stuff. So this is a Canaanite. So these are all Canaanite cities because we can tell that from what the hieroglyphs say. And each of them is presented as a captive slave of Pharaoh. Okay, because this is, and so their arms are tied behind their backs and they're captive slaves. And a lot of times they'd be marched into Egypt as slaves. But here, these are the cities in Canaan that are also slaves of Pharaoh. Here's another one. This is one of my favorites. Here's a picture of a Canaanite captive. His arms are bound behind his back. So this is this iconography of a captive prisoner. And here's the Canaanite is lying there. And here's the foot of Pharaoh. Okay, so this expresses the ideology of imperial domination over the Canaanites. The foot of Pharaoh is literally walking on the Canaanite. The Canaanite is under the feet of Pharaoh. We sort of use that idiom ourselves. Under the feet of so-and-so is under the feet of someone. Do we do that? Is that an idiom in English? Under the heel, yeah, we would say under the heel, yeah. But look, there's the heel. So it's the same kind of deal. And that looks uncomfortable for this Canaanite captive. He's got this big foot on him. And notice how big the foot is. This is Pharaoh's feet. Pharaoh's really big in Egyptian iconography. He's usually like 10 feet taller than any of the other people in Egyptian iconography. This is why when you go to a museum and you see these statues of the king, they're always so huge. But if you look at reliefs where the king is next to other people, the other people are like little ants next to the big pharaoh. So this is literally the foot of Pharaoh, big guy. He's like big Tex of ancient Egypt, walking on the poor Canaanite captive. And what I'm emphasizing is this Canaanite captive, okay, they took a lot of prisoners of war from the Pharaoh's wars in Canaan. They took a lot of them back to Egypt. So there were a lot of Canaanite slaves in Egypt. Okay? But what I want to emphasize is not only were there Canaanite slaves in Egypt, but in the ideology of empire, all of the Canaanites who were still living in Canaanite cities were also captives of Pharaoh under his feet and kind of functioned as slaves of Pharaoh. Pharaoh was their master, and they were dominated by him. So this is the ideology of empire. Now we find a reflex of this Egyptian ideology in letters by Canaanite kings to the Pharaoh. So this is not just Egyptian ideology from the point of view of the Egyptians. This ideology was also used and incorporated, internalized by the Canaanite rulers of the time. So the people in Canaan, we assume, knew that they were sort of slaves of Pharaoh. In the Amarna letters, and Na'ama will appreciate this, and I told John and Joanne I did this, because quoting the Amarna letters is always a crowd pleaser, right? So these are letters from Canaanite kings to the Pharaoh during the period of the Egyptian empire in Canaan. And they're one of our best, or one of our only sources of knowledge of what things looked at from the Canaanite perspective. So here's some examples. The Canaanite cities are called loyal slaves to Pharaoh. And it's actually a female slave because the city is a female noun. The Canaanite king is also a loyal slave of the king, of the Pharaoh. And this is kind of a formulaic thing. The kings always say, I am your loyal slave and I bow down to you. And 7 times in the dirt, and I'm self-abnegating myself to your great mastery. One of them, it says, Canaan is your country, and its kings, and there's a little lacuna there, but it's smartly filled in as its kings are your slaves. So Canaan is the Pharaoh's country. He owns the place, and its kings are his slaves. Now, slaves also means, subordinates. But the word is slaves. And it says everything belongs to the king, meaning the Pharaoh, which says the same thing. Now, furthermore, we know from the Amarna letters that the fertile valleys in Canaan, the Jezreel Valley and I think also the Sharon Valley, are claimed as royal lands, as Pharaoh's lands. And they used forced labor to work those lands, and the local kings had to supply people from their cities to do forced labor for Pharaoh on these in these pharaonic fields. So they were slaves to Pharaoh. They're being grabbed, and you're doing the agricultural work for Pharaoh. So from the point of the Canaanites, this idea that we are slaves to Pharaoh kind of has a real resonance here if you're a Canaanite and you're experiencing these things. I just love this. The picture of the Pharaoh's foot on the Canaanite, this is also part of the vocabulary of the relationship between Pharaoh and the Canaanites. So the Canaanite king says, "I am your slave, the dirt under the foot of my king." I love that because we have a picture of that. The Canaanite under the actual big foot of Pharaoh. And it's the king saying this. "I am dirt under the sandals of my king, my lord. I am a footstool for the feet of my king, my lord, and his loyal slave." And we actually have footstools that have engraved pictures of Canaanite captives and captive Nubians, which was another region of the Egyptian Empire, so that the king can literally put his foot on the footstools and his feet are on the people of Canaan and Nubia. Wow. "I will not move under the feet of my king, my lord." Well, of course you can't, because you saw how big that foot was. And here's a letter from Pharaoh back to the king, a response. This is a letter to another great king. He says, "Amun, who's the Egyptian high god, has indeed put the upper land, the lower land, where the sun rises, where the sun sets, under the feet of the king." And the upper land, I think it's pretty clear, refers to the Canaanite province of the Egyptian Empire, and the lower land refers to Nubia. So Canaan is in the east, where the sun rises. Nubia is where the sun sets. I'm not really sure because it's south rather than west. But the upper land refers, I think, to Canaan. Anyway, both of these lands are under the foot of the king. Everybody in these lands are slaves to the king, from the local city-state rulers all the way down. So this is the ideology of empire in which, at least in the rhetoric of empire, everyone's a slave to Pharaoh. He dominates them. And in case you get out of line and you say, "Well, I don't really want to be a slave to Pharaoh," they had all these huge military garrisons. This is an actual picture. No, it's not. This is a computer reconstruction of the Egyptian garrison at Jaffa, which is right by Tel Aviv, and there were a bunch of these. So these are kind of architecture of dominance that you can see, and there's Egyptian military guys there to keep everything under control. So you really are under the foot of Pharaoh if you're in Canaan, particularly during the latter centuries of the Egyptian Empire. So I argue, and I've convinced like 3 or 4 people in my field, that what we have in the Exodus story is a kind of reconfigured collective memory of the Egyptian Empire in Canaan, when everybody in Canaan was a slave to Pharaoh. The twist, of course, is that the Egyptian Empire collapses. To the local Canaanites, that's a fantastic thing. And it's easy to see how they could see that as their God defeating Pharaoh and liberating his people. Okay? And so this is how the story, I think, there's various transpositions from being slaves to Pharaoh in Canaan. In the story, you're slaves to Pharaoh in Egypt, and you move to Canaan after God defeats Pharaoh. Now, let me make a couple of points. First of all, as I mentioned, there actually were lots of Canaanite slaves in Egypt. And so there might have been actual Canaanite slaves in Egypt that after the collapse of the Egyptian Empire went to Canaan. And some of them might well have joined early Israel. The question, if they said, you know, we were just liberated from Egypt and came to Canaan, why would the rest of them adopt that story as their story? And that's because that would have resonance, because they too had been slaves to Pharaoh and were just liberated by him in, you know, a divine miracle, that the most powerful empire in the history of the world was not there anymore. So it works to have this memory become a story of divine defeat of chaos, of the forces of chaos, that is to say, the Egyptians, and the, you know, creation of a new people that God then plants in his holy habitation, this new hill country region. Now, another advantage of transposing the location from being slaves to Egypt and Canaan to all of them having been in Egypt and then moving to Canaan, is that is a way of making a strong boundary around your group. The group liberated from Egyptian slavery by God defeating Pharaoh, that's a particular group. It's created in this kind of liminal space between Egypt and Canaan in the wilderness after you cross the Red Sea. And then when you move into Canaan, you already have these strong boundaries, which distinguishes you from other Canaanites who are not Israelite. You see what I mean? So it's a very useful strategy to create a group boundary by saying the group really was created in the wilderness and moved into the land, which explains why there's other Canaanites 2 blocks away that are not us, right? They're Oklahomans. They're not Texans, right? Because there's a different story, different memories that define our group, and they're not part of it. They're part of a different group. So there are reasons why the geographical transposition from being politically under Egypt to being geographically in Egypt helps in the creation of a collective memory that has these strong group boundaries. It explains then why, you know, we look in our lifestyle and everything is the same as these Canaanites down the block. Why are we different? Well, the story explains that. You see what I mean? It's why Texans are different from Oklahomans. They might actually not be so different. I shouldn't say that. But they have different group memories that define who they are. Okay? So it's a way of explaining why Israelites are different from Canaanites, even if they all were Canaanites 10 years ago, 10 years previously. Okay, so we can see in this construction of the Nemo history of the Exodus, there is, there's history there, but it's been transformed, reimagined, reconstructed according to the needs and desires and social frameworks of this people of early Israel. And it makes, let me say, a great story. So you forget the boring story about how they really coalesced as a people, and you create this much more exciting and monumental history about how they came, and it's now worth, you know, commemorating in the Passover in 2 weeks. Okay, let me move on very quickly to the Queen of Sheba story, and I want to argue that the Nemo history of the Queen of Sheba story has some similar. It complements the Nemo history of the Exodus in some ways. Notice that what I'm saying is that the Exodus story itself is, I just thought of this last night, is in some ways a kind of post-colonial imaginary after having been a colony of Egypt. It's a way of exalting yourself vis-a-vis the Egypt and why we defeated them. The Queen of Sheba story has some similar things. This is a picture of the Queen of Sheba and Solomon from an Ethiopic text, and there's Ethiopic writing for those Ethiopic aficionados among you. I was talking with John Hunegard last night. He says he teaches this stuff. So this became an important part of the cultural memory of Ethiopian Christianity, where the king who was the founder of their imperial dynasty, the royal dynasty, they said was the offspring of Solomon and the Queen of Sheba. And they argued that the Queen of Sheba came from Ethiopia. which isn't actually true, but I'm not going to tell them that. Okay, so in the the Queen of Sheba story has this wealthy queen from the land of Sheba, which was a very, very wealthy nation that was made its money from the incense trade. It's in southern Saudi Arabia or Yemen, and that's where the incense comes from, and the incense went up. And one of the roots of the incense actually went through ancient Israel and ended up at Gaza, the seaport there. So what do I want to say? Okay, so it says in the Queen of Sheba story, yeah, it says Solomon, in 1 Kings chapter 5, Solomon ruled over all the kingdoms from the Euphrates to the land of the Philistines and as far as the boundary of Egypt. They brought him tribute and served Solomon all the days of his life. He had peace on all his borders round about. Judah and Israel dwelled securely, each person under their vine and their fig tree, from Dan to Beersheba, all the days of Solomon. And Solomon made silver in Jerusalem as abundant as stones. And there's a lot of stones in Jerusalem, so that's a lot of silver. So this is a golden age. Solomon is the wisest king ever, and he's ruling this massive kingdom from Mesopotamia to Egypt, and all the kings are bringing him gifts and tribute, and it's just wealthy as can be. The whole nation, they're at peace, and they're wealthy, and it's wonderful. So this is the golden age of Solomon. Now let me tell you again, it's archaeologists who are the spoil sports here. They tell us the period of Solomon, when you look at the archaeological evidence, was a poor, nothing kingdom. Okay, that Solomon was, I'm losing members of the audience by the dozen. But it's not me, the archaeologists say this. So it was, you know, Jerusalem was like an administrative center of a small state, and there's like one impressive building in Jerusalem of Solomon's time, and not a sign of silver as abundant as stones. This is what is forgotten in the story of King Solomon, that it was kind of a nothing kingdom, and none of this stuff. But notice that you make the story better, okay? The story of the Queen of Sheba, she comes to test how wise Solomon is. And he passes all of her tests. She asks him all these riddles, and he knows everything she asks, and there's nothing that she asks that he's not able to tell her. He's also vastly wealthy, and so to honor him, she gives him a massive gift of her wealth, including precious stones and incense, frankincense and myrrh. And it says there was never a larger amount of precious incense that that the Queen of Sheba gave to Solomon. So massive stuff. And let me say, the incense trade in antiquity was like petroleum today. It was a source of vast wealth. It was used in medicine, it was used in rituals, it was used in like, you know, perfume and stuff. And so it was like, and it was expensive. And so the incense trade made a lot of people rich. No one more so than the kings of Sheba, who controlled the incense trade. So the Queen of Sheba, she's incredibly rich, and she gives all these wonderful gifts to Solomon, and he, being so rich himself, gives her gifts also. So these are two great, wealthy, and wise royals that are kind of recognizing each other as, you know, it's like the Rockefellers meeting the, I don't know, the Gettys, or what would be a Texas example. You know, two wealthy oil men giving each other gold Cadillacs or something. Okay? They're showing off, but they're also showing respect to the other as being on the same level as them. Now, we looked a little bit at what the actual history was. The actual history was forgotten. Solomon was kind of a schlump, and the era was poor. So what might be going on in actual history that's being somehow drawn upon here. Well, this is an image from the actual incense trade, which was a very big thing, and it became a big thing in the 8th and 7th centuries BC, which is hundreds of years after Solomon. Okay? But it went through Israel. There was a branch. It went through North Africa, and part of it went to Mesopotamia, and part of it, as I said, went through Judah and ended up at Gaza, where they would put it on boats and go elsewhere. So this is a limestone incense altar, which means incense was burned on it. So that shows that was being traded and used in Israel. And here's a picture. You can barely see it. It's an incised picture of a camel. See this guy? And so camels were the vehicles of the incense trade. They would bring them from southern Arabian Peninsula all the way up, and that's a long way, so only camels can last that long, and then they bring them up, and it's this precious, expensive commodity. And this was probably made in South Arabia, but it was found in Beersheba, which was one of the way stations of this incense trade on the way to Gaza. So people are making money from this. Now let me read to you an interesting thing about this. I've mentioned that there are kings of Sheba were in charge of the incense trade. There's no queens in ancient Sheba. That's another problem. But there were queens of North Arabian tribes that were involved in the incense trade. So this looks like it's part of the Nemo history of the Queen of Sheba. She's identified as the Queen of Sheba, which controlled the incense trade, but she somehow seems to be derived in one way or another from the memory of these queens of North Arabian tribes. We know of 7 queens of these North Arabian tribes from Assyrian documents. One of them is named Samsi, Queen of the Arabs. And this might be, and that's the question mark, a picture of her. She has bracelets on her left arm. In her right arm, she's holding something that looks like the kind of container that incense was transported in. And she has just been defeated by the Assyrian army, and this is in this is a victory relief from Tiglath-Pileser III, who in his annals talks about the conquest, the defeat of Queen Samsi of the Arabs, and all the camels and incense and precious stones that he took from her. So this is a depiction of this event in the Assyrian annals. He says, "As for Samsi, queen of the Arabs, at Mount Sakuri I defeated 9,400 of her warriors. I took away from her 1,000 people, 30,000 camels, 20,000 oxen, 5,000 bags of all types of aromatics." And the editor thinks that this is one of the size of the bags of aromatics, precious aromatics. Moreover, in order to save her life, she set out like a female onager to the desert. I set the rest of her stuff on fire. She was startled by my mighty weapons, and she brought camels, she-camels, and their young to Assyria before me, and I made her bow down at my feet. There's other texts that follow this about how once he defeated Samsi, queen of the Arabs, others of the Arab kings and polities also went to Assyria and offered vast tribute to the king, again including precious incense, frankincense and myrrh and stuff. So these things are going on in the 8th and 7th centuries, where queens of Arabia are bringing gifts of tribute to the Assyrian king. Okay? And the Assyrian king was the great king of this period. In Judah and Israel, they were subject to the Assyrian Empire. So here's another imperial story here from the point of view of the subjected people. In the story of the Queen of Sheba, it's not the queens of Arabia bringing these great gifts to the Assyrian king. No. They're bringing it to Solomon, or she's bringing it to Solomon, who's the greatest of all kings. Now notice what's going on here. On the one hand, the story of the Queen of Sheba bringing all this stuff to Solomon, it exalts Solomon as the greatest of all kings. the richest, the wisest, and everything. What I'm arguing about the Nemo history is that this is written during the period when queens of Arabia are bringing great riches of tribute to the Assyrian king, to whom the Israelites, the Judeans and Israelites, were also subjected at that time. So they're again in this situation of being, ideological slaves to this foreign king who's getting all these goodies from the Arabian queens. What does it mean to reconfigure these details to create a memory, an imagined memory, of your own glory days, where the queens of Sheba are bringing this great stuff to Solomon? On the one hand, it gives you a great pedigree, okay? And on the other hand, it says we're the ones that have the great king to whom the Queen of Sheba brought this great stuff. More incense than anyone ever brought to anyone else, including this. And secondly, it's also kind of subtly, I would argue, a kind of subtle critique of the Assyrian Empire. It's a critique of the Assyrian king, because look, our king was way better than you, and he got all these goodies way before you did. So ha ha, we're better than you, even though, we're under your feet right now. So it's also, in its own way, a kind of anti-colonial imagined past that is critiquing the current empire, in this case, and saying we're the ones, we checkmate you, because we have Solomon and the Queen of Sheba, and you just have these, crummy little things going on these days. So it's an exaltation of Israel's own self-consciousness as a nation at a time when it's under the feet of this foreign king. And it's also a kind of dig at this foreign king. It's kind of mimicking what's going on there, but saying what we had was even better. So it kind of puts the Assyrian king down a few pegs compared with our great king Solomon. So it's almost in a way a kind of compensation for the situation that exists now, in imagining a great past which kind of relieves in some respect the subjugation that Israel was experiencing at that time. Okay, so here's, and also, again, let me reiterate, the time of Solomon was not only a time of great wealth, and he was a great wise king, but also the emphasis on the time of peace. Everyone was happy. Everyone was under their vine and fig tree, and the silver is all over the place. It's a much better time than the time of the present with this Assyrian king, under the hegemony of the Assyrian king. Okay, so this is my proposal for the Nemo history of the Queen of Sheba. Now I just want to conclude by emphasizing the importance of collective memory. Okay, and again, just the Alamo itself example tells you the importance. But in the biblical stories, I want to point out that the future memory of these events is built into the stories themselves. And this is very much the case in the Exodus story. Solomon and Sheba doesn't really have this kind of meta comment that you should remember this. But in the Exodus story, this happens over and over again. It's very interesting. While the story is going on, God is giving commands that you should remember this. Okay, and there's a very interesting place in Exodus 10. This is within the plague stories. The plagues haven't all happened yet. The Exodus hasn't happened yet. And God is telling Moses, it's kind of a meta comment that explains to Moses why all this stuff is happening. And God says to Moses, I have multiplied these plagues, and I have hardened Pharaoh's heart. I've hardened Pharaoh's heart so that I could multiply these plagues, okay? And so that you may recount them in the ears of your children and your children's children, how I dealt harshly with Egypt with my signs that I set among them, that you may know that I am Yahweh. Now notice, God's explaining to Moses why he hardened Pharaoh's heart. We were talking about this earlier. So that he could send a lot of plagues, so he could multiply his signs and wonders, which makes it essentially a better story. so that you may recount in your ears of your children and children how I did all this stuff with these signs I set among them. This is why I multiplied the signs, to make it a more spectacular story, right? If you had the movie The Ten Commandments with just one plague, it wouldn't be as good a movie. You want to, Steven Spielberg would tell you, you have to multiply the special effects to make it really fantastic. And this is what Yahweh's the director of these events. He's saying, this is why I hardened his heart, so I could send over and over again these spectacular series of plagues, so that you could tell them to your children and your children's children. So I made these events so spectacular to make a story that you would tell in the future to your children and children's children. Okay? And then the final phrase, that you may know that I am Yahweh, that Yahweh is the one that was so powerful and did this, but it's also, there's a kind of implicit background, so that you know that I am Yahweh, and as it says elsewhere over and over again, and you are my people. So the story itself serves to define the people, the boundaries of the people. This is their memory. Okay? And Yahweh is their God, and they are his people, and the story is there to recount and to reactualize that self-identity and that religious relationship. And this is why in this Passover story, you tell the story again. It's commanded to recount the story, and this is why. The story, in a sense, makes the people and makes their, religious system and so forth. It makes them and so then later, and after the plagues are over, but before the Exodus itself, well, actually before the last plague, before the killing of the firstborn, in Exodus 13, Moses says to the people, remember this day when you went out of Egypt from the house of slavery, how with a strong hand Yahweh brought you from here. Now notice this hasn't actually happened yet. The Exodus hasn't happened yet. They haven't crossed the Red Sea yet. They haven't had the slaying of the firstborn son. So even before the events have happened, Moses is saying, remember this day when this stuff happened, which hasn't happened yet, but I think it's going to happen. And then you're going to tell this story about how Yahweh delivered the people from Egypt. And then it says it again. It's a leitmotif in this chapter. When your child asks you in the future, saying, what is this? You will say, with a strong hand God brought us out of Egypt. And you shall tell your children on that day, because of what Yahweh did for me when I went out of Egypt. And he says this before they went out of Egypt. So the importance of memory, the command to remember, is built into the story even before the events are completed. So the importance of collective memory, and even the point of the story to create the objects of memory, to create the story that is then remembered, is foregrounded in the story itself, even in the middle of the story, before the story is over. So it's not that cultural memory is kind of a secondary or tertiary effect of these stories. They're the reason for the stories. The stories are the cultural memory of ancient Israel, and the stories themselves say that, or at least the Exodus does. And this is, I think, in a way, to return to the idea that a nation is built on a rich legacy of memories. These are the memories, and the command to memory is central there, that in a sense is a way that the nation and people of ancient Israel, in a sense, narrated itself into being. That is to say, it's the stories themselves that create the people, as much as the people create the stories. You see what I'm saying? It's kind of a strange idea, but I think it's really highlighted in these quotes. Okay, thank you very much.
We have a few minutes for questions. I will, if you want to ask a question, please feel free to raise your hand, and I'll hand you a microphone to put this on record.
Oh, none of this is on record, is it?
Thank you so much. This is fascinating. Ariel Yulitsky from the law school. So I have two-part question. One is, if these are particular stories, biblical stories creating social memory, is the whole purpose of the Bible to create a collective social memory? And the second part, if I can complete the question, is why these particular stories become so central to the social memory of the Jewish people, and why no other biblical stories?
And why? What's the last part?
Why not other biblical stories? Because the Bible has tons of different stories. And this is the only one at Pesach, or Passover.
Yeah, yeah. So this is the big story at Pesach. Well, the title of my talk is The Bible as a Book of Memory. So I would say, in defense of this title, the Bible is a book of memory. The Bible, and I kind of mean this in two different senses. On the one hand, the Bible is a kind of archive of these collective memories of ancient Israel. And so all of the stories, all of the narratives are part of the library. So it's not just one story. I mean, the Exodus is really central to the formation of the people. So it's really a rich story to look at in this respect. But all of the stories are the archives of collective memory of ancient Israel. Some of them have an easier mnemo history because they're historical. These are have a more complicated mnemo history because we can see big chunks of history that were forgotten in order for these stories to take place. Or that it's not so much totally forgotten, but kind of reconfigured. The history is reconfigured to make it a better story. So I think a lot of the Bible can be looked at as a collection of memories. And some of them are more central than others. I would also emphasize that some of them are counter memories to other memories. Mm-hmm. For example, there's aspects of the Exodus story that are familiar to us, the giving of the law at Mount Sinai and things like that. Jeremiah has a counter memory. He says, you never gave laws to us in the wilderness, so we don't need all these laws. We just want to be, morally upright and things like that. So different people in the Bible are making use of these shared memories to stake out different claims. So there are counter memories in the Bible. And you can use these collective memories to make different kinds of cases. So there's always argument going on. The other point I would make is that in addition to being kind of this archive of ancient Israelite memories, many of which are in tension with each other, and deliberately so, because you're arguing about the past, like we argue about the Alamo or the Columbus Day and stuff. The Bible as a book also serves as the kind of canonical, authoritative book of memory for Judaism and then Christianity. So they continue to be memories after they've all been textualized and compiled. So it's a book of memories not just for the ancient Israelites, but for the religions that come from ancient Israel. And people are still arguing about those memories. What are the implications of this story for, gay marriage or something? We were talking about that in a class today. So people are still use it as a compendium of memories that are important for contemporary social circumstances and contemporary frameworks of memory. So I really mean that the Bible is a book of memory, but I mean it in two different ways. One, it's a collection of ancient Israelite memories, and then it becomes the library of memories for Jews and Christians that we get to continue arguing over. And one could go on ad infinitum about how these memories are still contested and used as political starting points for all sorts of disputes that are very live and sometimes very unfortunate in the present world. Now, there's some things that people don't really put a lot of weight on, like the genealogies and chronicles. But still, there's a genealogical connectivity that provides a kind of metaphor for the people, and so even boring stuff can serve as kind of connective memories, like genealogies and stuff. I'm sure you've all studied the first, 8 chapters of Chronicles, which is one long genealogy. One of my favorite sections of the whole Hebrew
But
Bible.
it's there too, it's important what they don't include.
That's true, yes. So Chronicle is a counter memory to Samuel and Kings. And they leave out, they deliberately forget things that are problematic in those earlier books. So that's a really interesting case of contested memories of the past and deliberate forgetting of things that are problematic.
I have maybe one more question.
So I understand your story of Exodus and why it's important, but there are other stories following on that question that are also really fundamental to the building of the people. And one of them is the restoration, right? The return from the exile. It's really crucial to the building of, the people, I don't know, the us, right? The Jews that are us, much more than the Exodus. Because this is the smaller group, right, that builds then to become the Dead Sea Scrolls and the early Judaism, whatever.
Okay.
I mean, they can be seen that way, but nobody celebrates that. It's not an important event.
Mm-hmm. Okay, yeah. So let me inject another aspect here. So God is, as I said in that little bit from Exodus chapter 10, God is telling Moses, he's kind of stepping behind the curtain and saying why these things are happening. And he says these things are happening to be able to multiply my signs and wonders so that you can tell all this magnificent stuff about how I toyed with the Egyptians with these signs. In other words, it's a good story. No one gave that same advice to the writers of Ezra and Nehemiah.
Okay, but what about Second Isaiah? It's a great story in Second Isaiah.
Well, it is a great story, and the apocalypse, this is Isaiah, who's a prophet of the exile, and then third Isaiah is the prophet of the return. Some of the great stuff in Isaiah has a tremendous legs in the afterlife of those memories. I mean, apocalypticism comes out of second Isaiah, which was a very successful enterprise. So, prophecy, I think, doesn't do story as much as, connects the past and the present and the future. And I'd say second Isaiah's best stuff was very productive in that respect.
So Israel and Nehemiah are just terrible writers. And so
Well,
The-
I would
yeah.
interject in both those books that you're dealing with texts that retell the Exodus story. They retell
Yes,
the stories of
yes.
the angelic return through the lens
Yes,
of Exodus. So
yes.
Nehemiah become
Yeah.
Moses and Aaron and these figures to
but
understand who they are.
but it's a much more boring story.
It's a
It's
more,
a much more poorly written story.
yeah, but I think that's part of it. You got to have a zippy writing to make a good story. But I think that also, I think, Jonathan, your point ties some of these together. That the story of the return to Zion is self-consciously a replication, a reiteration of the Exodus story.
Yeah.
And so and second Isaiah is using the Exodus story again in all of these ways. So in a sense, they're all part of the afterlife of the Exodus story.
And then it dies as an important memory. Of the
Then what?
It dies out while the Exodus is still an important.
But I would still say that second Isaiah's invention of apocalypticism was very successful. Prophecy became a big thing because of this linking of the past, present, and future. So that adds a whole nother dimension to, it's kind of, I guess I would like to call it in a paradoxical way, future memory that they encode. It becomes the future memory of its communities.
It seems like for Ezra and Nehemiah too, you have to have plausibility. When you're talking about things that happened way long ago, you can build it greater and greater.
Yeah.
But then they've got such a small group, they've got to, can't make it too
They can
crazy.
BS everybody.
Exactly, yeah. Because people remember.
Yeah.
And you can think of, does fourth Ezra pump up Ezra a little bit more? you need someone to make a story that makes Solomon the richest and wisest and most powerful king of his time, and no one ever really did that for Ezra and Nehemiah. So you need a good publicist.
Assholes. Yeah.
Well, on that note, please join me again in thanking Professor Hendel.
Now, please, if any of you attend a Passover Seder in a couple of weeks, don't say anything of this. It'll just upset people. I can tell you from personal experience.